Hi everyone, and welcome to video number 14 on the American West. And this video, ladies and gentlemen, looks at crime, law and order on the Great Plains, particularly two events, two things that happened. We're going to look at the impact of the railways and then the impact of the American Civil War on the plains, with paying particular attention to crime and law and order. Now, in our previous video, we showed many ways that railways had changed the plains. One way was creating new towns along the railroad. Many of these, so-called cow towns, the cowboys brought the cattle from down in the south here, down by Texas, and they brought them north to where the railroad was, because cattle from here had to be sold to the big cities in the east. And the way of doing it, as we'll see later, was to get the cattle to the railway to take them east. Now, that's not a problem until you think that the journey from Texas to the railway was a long, tiring, difficult, tough journey. Many weeks, sometimes months. The cowboys were working very, very hard. Now, when they arrived at the railroad, when they arrived in the cow towns, guess what? They got paid. Hooray! Yee-haw! As the cowboys would say. Now, once they're paid, they've just had a really long period of hard work. What do you think they wanted to do? Celebrate, let off steam, go out gambling, go out drinking. Fair enough, you should say. Unless, of course, it led to trouble, unless it led to violence. And many of the cow towns at that time were called Hell on Wheels. Well, what does that tell us, ladies and gentlemen, about the cow towns? One famous example, a town called Abilene in the state of Kansas. That was linked to the railroad in 1867. The population in Abilene went from 500 up to 7,000. It became a boom town because of the railroad, because of the cattle. Good news. People are setting up businesses. People are making money. It was a boom town. But it's also led to an increase in crime. People getting drunk, people gambling, people fighting, prostitution, saloon bars, murder. This was rather unacceptable to many of the law-abiding residents in the town, who often felt outnumbered and scared. Well, what would the answer be? Well, what do you think, ladies and gentlemen? One answer, of course, is to appoint a sheriff. Of course, someone whose job it is to try and keep the law, to try and stop these crimes. And in Abilene, 1870, they appointed a man called Thomas Smith as the new town marshal of Abilene. He was a tough man. The first thing he did was to ban guns in the town. Now, as I've just hinted, he was a tough man. He would not mind at all punching and knocking out some of the cowboys who were causing trouble. And for a while, things improved in Abilene because Thomas Smith was doing a good job. Until, sadly for Thomas Smith, he was killed by a criminal, murdered. And then the problems, of course, would return. 6 months later, Abilene try again. They appoint a new town marshal, a man called William Hickok, known to history as Wild Bill Hickok. He also was a tough man, and he also was feared. People did not want to go against Wild Bill Hickok. Unfortunately for Abilene, though, Wild Bill Hickok also liked to drink. He also liked to gamble. And he spent quite a lot of time in the saloon bar himself instead of doing the job. In the end, the townspeople had to act. they got rid of Wild Bill Hickok and they banned cowboys, which again brings down the crime, but also brings down the amount of money coming into Abilene. So we see straight away that some of these cow towns were quite difficult places. There was quite a lot of crime in some of these areas. Now, if that's the railways, what about the impact of the United States Civil War on law and order, crime on the plains? Well, putting it quite simply, the impact was huge. Lawlessness increased for many reasons because of the Civil War. Here's a few for you. Men from the southern states had lost the war. They were angry. They were resentful against the winners, the North. They might not want to obey the laws of the North. Many men had been upset, traumatized by what they'd seen throughout the 4 years of terrible warfare. Now, if they'd been upset, traumatized, they found it difficult to live within what we would say is a normal society, and they would maybe decide to live outside of society's normal laws. Many were deserters. They had run away from the army because the war was so terrible. Well, if they've run away, they're in trouble with the law, so they might decide to live outside the law as well. And finally, many had lost their jobs, so they were poor and angry. Some of them would turn to crime in order to survive. So as a result of the United States Civil War, for all the reasons that I've just outlined there was an increase in the number of gangs of outlaws made up of the men that I've just listed. So we come to the outlaws. Oh, now then, if you get people running like this at you, how are you going to know who it is? Maybe if I had a hat on covering my grey hair, you wouldn't know who it was. So this was a bit of a problem for people who were trying to keep the law in these places. There's an increase in the number of gangs of outlaws. Often, the gangs themselves were very large, difficult to deal with. One example is a gang called the Reno Gang. Not only were they tough, living outside the law, a lot of them, they also bribed sheriffs to look away, ignore them, so that they could get on with their crimes. 1866, a train robbery, robbing the trains. Remember the railway playing a part again, ladies and gentlemen? The Reno Gang took $16,000. Well, remember, if a lot of them are poor, the attraction of taking $16,000 is quite a lot. A few years later, another train robbery, this time almost $100,000. Well, what could people do about this? Sheriffs may be slightly bribed. Sheriffs may be outnumbered. There was another solution, and it was called a National Detective Agency called the Pinkertons, 1850, set up by a man called Alfred Pinkerton. And people would hire the detectives, and they did have some success. For example, the Pinkertons dealt with, arrested and sorted out the Reno Gang. There were other gangs. One very famous one, the James and Younger Gang. Frank James and his brother, Jesse James. They were ex-soldiers from the Southern Army, the Confederate Army in the Civil War. And they robbed banks, stagecoaches and trains. Reminds me of that old joke. One outlaw decides to give it up. He became a dentist. And what do you think he did? He robbed his patients at gunpoint. Sorry, I was just filling in there. That's enough dentist jokes. So crime was a problem at certain times. in certain parts of the plains and the American West. Not everywhere, not always. Some people were very law-abiding, but crime was an issue, ladies and gentlemen. Now, other impacts or other consequences of the American Civil War. It was a massive event in American history. There you go. Nice thick book on the American Civil War. I've read it, you don't have to. Okay? There were a huge number of consequences, ladies and gentlemen. Now, there's so many, you might want to sit down as I go through them. Well, what will you sit on, I hear you cry? Of course, get yourself sat down in chairs. Why do I say that? Because of that, ladies and gentlemen. Consequences of the Civil War. One easy way to remember it is to use the word chairs. C for cattle, H for homesteaders, A for abolished slavery, I for Indians lost land, R for railways, S for the South lost. 600,000 dead. I'll run through these very, very quickly for us. Now, cattle. In case you didn't know what a cow looked like. Cattle. They had a huge impact on the development of the cattle industry, herding, ranching, moving across America. It's very, very important. So important, I'll concentrate on just that in the next video. I will look at the cattle industry on its own. But it was an important consequence of the American Civil War. Got to remember, there was money involved. So there was a lot at stake. Sorry, apologies. H for homesteaders. As we saw in the previous video, once the South had removed itself from government and fought against the North, the South was not making any laws. So the northern states could make the laws, and they did. Remember the Homestead Act, 1862, which attracted people, and people moved onto the plains. After the Civil War, more people are moving because they want new opportunities. They're looking for new opportunities after all the problems of the previous 4 years, 1861 to 65. So the homesteaders, as we saw in the previous video, a big impact of the war. A, abolish slavery. If you remember, one of the reasons for the war was that the northern states wanted to abolish slavery and the southern states didn't, because they had all the big plantations which relied on slave labour. But the North won the war. Therefore, they had the power to introduce the new laws to stop the slavery, which, as a direct consequence, led to more black people moving to the American West and the plains, another consequence of the American Civil War. I, the Indians lost land. Some of the Native American tribes had supported the South because that's where they were in the country. But the South had lost. So now these tribes, these North American Native Indian tribes, they'd also lost. They'd lost their treaty protection for their Indian territory. And that was to cause trouble later on, as we'll see later in the course. So we've done C, H, A, I. The last couple are for railways. Well, we've seen that in this video. The railways linked the farms in the west across the plains to the cities in the east. Led to more development, more trains, more communication, more towns, more movement of population. The railways had a huge impact after the Civil War. And finally, the S. The southern states lost. 600,000, north and south, had died. It was a huge hit to the American society. American culture was changing, abolishing slavery, for example. The American economy needed to be reboosted. It needed a new start. It was called the Reconstruction. Things had changed, and the Great Plains, as a result of the war and the railways, also had changed. So, I hope the video has been useful, looking at the impact of the railway and the war on the development of the plains, 1860s, 1870s and into the 80s. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one huge area of change was the cattle industry, cattle ranches. So, our next video, we'll have a look in detail at how that impacted, with specific examples, the development of the Great Plains. As ever, I hope it's been, hopefully, a little bit useful. All the best now. See you soon. Bye now.